Meine sehr verehrten Damen, meine Herren, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, liebe Gäste, sehr herzlich begrüße ich Sie auch im Namen meiner Vorstandskollegin Bianca Richard hier im wiederaufgebauten Max-Liebermann-Haus in unserer kleinen, feinen Stiftung Brandenburger Tor, der Kulturstiftung der Berliner Sparkasse, zu unserer 42. Arnheim Lecture. Es ist, wie die schöne Musik, gespielt vom Klarinettenensemble Berlin, es ist in der Musik schon feierlich angedeutet hat, es ist unsere 42. und zugleich unsere letzte, unsere finale Arnheim Lecture. Zu diesem feierlichen, aber auch ein wenig wehmütigen Anlass begrüße ich besonders herzlich den Redner des heutigen Abends, Herrn Jonathan Katz von der University of Pennsylvania und Frau Professorin Eva Ehninger, Professorin für Kunstgeschichte der Moderne am Institut für Kunst und Bildgeschichte der Humboldt-Universität. Willkommen, Sie beide, hier am Brandenburger Tor, ein Platz, an dem man ja gerade nicht so unmittelbar hinkommt, aber Sie haben es alle gefunden. Eva Ehninger wird Ihnen unseren Redner Jonathan Katz gleich ausführlich vorstellen. Lassen Sie mich nur noch einige Worte zur Arnheim Lecture sagen. Sie war in jedem Sommer oder Winter oder Wintersemester der öffentliche Abschlussvortrag jener exquisiten Rudolf Arnheim Gastprofessur, die Horst Bredekamp vor fast 25 Jahren erfunden hat. Im Jahr 2000 schrieb er dem 96-jährigen Rudolf Arnheim in die USA einen Brief mit der Frage, ob dieser einverstanden sei, dass eine Gastprofessur ausländischer Wissenschaftlerinnen und Wissenschaftler an seiner einstigen Berliner Universität zu allen nur möglichen Fragen der Bildwissenschaft seinen Namen tragen dürfe. Rudolf Arnheim, Begründer der Wahrnehmungs- und Gestaltpsychologie und berühmt als Kunst- wie auch als Filmhistoriker, Arnheim, der in den 20er Jahren sein Institut im Berliner Schloss hatte und vor den Nationalsozialisten ins amerikanische Exil flüchten konnte. Rudolf Arnheim war gerührt ob der Anfrage aus Berlin. Er fand allerdings, dass eine solch internationale Gastprofessur zu den Bildkünsten nicht seinen Namen, sondern den Namen von Georg Simmel tragen sollte, der Philosoph und Soziologe, der wegen seiner jüdischen Herkunft nie eine ordentliche Professur in Berlin des Wilhelminischen Kaiserreiches erlangt hat. Horst Bredekamp, der heute leider nicht bei uns sein kann, weil er in Turin eine Vortragsverpflichtung hat, versicherte Rudolf Arnheim, dass es eine Georg Simmel Gastprofessur bereits gäbe, und so willigte Rudolf Arnheim ein, dass diese neue Gastprofessur, begründet als Kooperation zwischen der Humboldt-Universität, dem Deutschen Akademischen Austauschdienst, den staatlichen Museen zu Berlin und der Stiftung Brandenburger Tor als dem Ort der öffentlichen Abschlussvorlesung, dass diese Arnheim-Gastprofessur seinen Namen tragen dürfe. Seit fast 25 Jahren berief eine interdisziplinäre Jury alljährlich Dozentinnen und Dozenten aus der neuen und alten Welt zu einer solchen Gastprofessur an die Humboldt-Universität nach Berlin. Es waren Wissenschaftlerinnen und Wissenschaftler sowie Künstlerinnen und Künstler, die an einer Hochschule, Forschungseinrichtung oder in einem Museum ihres Heimatlandes beschäftigt waren. Es waren Gäste aus Indien, Argentinien, China und den USA, aber auch aus Frankreich, Großbritannien, Irland, Finnland, Polen und Italien. Die abschließende Arnheim Lecture hier am Brandenburger Tor handelte unter anderem von der Ästhetik des Pinselstriches in der frühen chinesischen Malerei oder über das digitale Gemüt, was immer das ist, über Feminism and Activism in Latin American Arts, über die Ritter der Demokratie in der zeitgenössischen europäischen Kunst, über Sharon, Sarin, Guerry, Technology, Architecture and Expressionism, über Georg Simmels Rembrandt-Monographie von 1916 oder über Philip Gaston und die radikale antirassistische Arbeiterbewegung in den USA. Und heute hören wir Jonathan Katz, How AIDS Changed American Art. Nach der Einführung des Redners durch Eva Ehninger und nach dem Vortrag von Jonathan Katz diskutieren Sie alle gewiss sehr lebhaft über die These von Jonathan Katz, dass AIDS eine der stärksten prägenden Kräfte in den amerikanischen Künsten seit den 1980er Jahren gewesen ist. Die Andy Warhol-Ausstellung in der Neuen Nationalgalerie wird gewiss zur Diskussion beitragen. Nach dieser Diskussion hören wir nochmals das Klarinettenensemble und dann gehen wir einen Stock höher auf Liebermanns Balkon zu einem kleinen Empfang. Mir bleibt nur noch der Dank an das Klarinettenensemble Berlin für die so freundliche Musik zu vielleicht einem nicht ganz fröhlichen Anlass, die finale Arnheim-Lecture. Und Dank an die Mitarbeiter der Stiftung Brandenburger Tor, besonders an Franziska Fenner, die diesen Abend heute hier vorbereitet hat, und an Natascha Trieber für alles Kommunikative, was ja in Zeiten des Digitalen nicht einfacher geworden ist. Und natürlich zum Finale der große Dank an all unsere Kooperationspartner, diese ingeniösen Arnheim-Gastprofessor, und natürlich an ihren Erfinder Horst Bredekamp. Die Arnheim Lectures, so Horst Bredekamp heute in einer Nachricht aus Turin, haben verdient, insgesamt als historisch benannt zu werden. Sie gehören zu meinen schönsten Erinnerungen, aber alles hat seine Geschichte. Ende dieses Zitats. Dass die Geschichte der Arnheim Lecture heute zu Ende sein soll, aufgrund vielfacher Förderkürzungen des Bundes beim DAAD, ich kann und will es noch nicht für endgültig halten. Wie auch immer, ich danke Ihnen allen für Ihr so angenehm zahlreiches Hiersein. Ich bin überrascht an diesem Pariser Platz. Ich wünsche Ihnen allen einen erkenntnisreichen Abend. Und nun bitte ich Eva Ehninger und Jonathan Katz hierher. Bitte herzlichen Dank Ihnen.
Dear Peter-Klaus Schuster, esteemed colleagues and guests, dear students, dear Jonathan. My name is Eva Ehninger. I'm professor for modern art history at the Institute of Art and Visual History at Humboldt-University, and it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce tonight Jonathan Katz, our Arnheim Professor of the year 2024. When he's not here in Berlin with us, Jonathan teaches at the University of Pennsylvania, Philadelphia in the US, as professor of practice, history of art and gender, sexuality, and women's studies. and he travels across the US and internationally in order to realize his ambitious and groundbreaking exhibitions on queer art and visual culture, such as, for example, the 2010 Hide and Seek, Difference and Desire in American Portraiture, an exhibition at the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery, the recent exhibit about Face, Stonewall, Revolt and New Queer Art from 2019 in Chicago, or the upcoming exhibition, The First Homosexuals, which will open in Chicago in 2025 and then travel to Latin America and Europe. As the chair of the first department of queer studies in the US at City College of San Francisco, as the first tenured faculty in this field, as founder of the first queer studies program at Yale University, as well as the first doctoral program in queer visual studies at the University of Buffalo, Jonathan Katz has been a central figure in the establishment of the field of queer studies in the US and well beyond. His scholarship of individual artists such as Jasper Jones, Robert Indiana, John Cage, Agnes Martin, Robert Rauschenberg, or Andy Warhol, to name just a few, as well as his theoretical work on gender, sexuality, and desire, has had broad impact on the development and subsequent implementation of queer history and theory in art historical writing and curricula worldwide. And it has inspired many of us to critically engage with the biases, oppressions, and blind spots of our own field. With his writing, Jonathan turns art historical conventions of valuation and interpretation on their head, which have long motivated and structured the analysis, the theorizing, as well as the exhibiting policies of modern and contemporary art. Under Jonathan's pen, for example, a photograph becomes a medium not of inevitable loss of that which has been, but a mirror reflecting an endlessly renewable present. Or his writing transforms the devastating HIV virus into a generative force, which was applied by artists to make both postmodern art and its institutions their own. Artistic media become ways and tools for both viewers and artists to seize control imaginatively and creatively in the face of a deathly pandemic and a similarly unforgiving political climate. This reinscription of agency into art, the artist and the viewer, also entails a thorough critique of postmodernist theory as such. Jonathan turns his argument against a common postmodernist assumption based on Roland Barthes' credo of the death of the author, that all art which still engages directly with its immediate social context is blatantly and dangerously naive. He points out that the concept of the death of the author becomes an arrogant, even brutal framework of thought when artistic authors actually do fall victim to a ravaging virus. During the 1980s, this powerful trope of postmodern thought and theorizing, though understood as informed by a leftist post-structuralist body of theory, in effect silenced and marginalized artistic positions just as much as right-wing homophobic political framework that was in place. And even though Jonathan has developed his argument with a view on the AIDS pandemic and its consequences in the 1980s, both the critical and the political framework that he engages with have lost little of their power even today. Artists and art critics and art historians, for that matter, can and have countered these tendencies by engaging in a poetic postmodernism, as Jonathan argues. And I won't say too much about this term, as it might come up in your lecture, Jonathan, and also I'm guessing that many of you will be familiar with it. But what I do want to touch on in closing is the fact that this poetic agency, the well-informed, exceedingly smart, and sometimes humorous application of formal and critical devices for the sake of a covert, latent, but very effective political positioning, that this poetic agency not only encompasses the artworks that Jonathan analyzes. Jonathan's own writing, which I admire for its beauty and elegance, coupled with piercing, deft, and precise criticism, has such qualities as well. His texts are, I think, poetic knives, which with great precision carve out the discriminatory foundations of art theory. They draw poetic analogies, which render the art world as intimately connected to and necessarily determined by the social realities that surround it. And his writing provides poetic magnifying glasses, which give readers the opportunity and the ethical responsibility to look beyond conventions of seeing and judging. The Arnheim professorship at the Institute for Art and Cultural Kunst und Bildgeschichte, was developed as a format that would bring our students in contact with critical discourses on contemporary art, as they are shaped by scholars of international renown. And as Peter-Klaus Schuster has shown us, we very much succeeded in that during the past years. But nobody could be more fitting an Arnheim professor than Jonathan Katz, a scholar who has dedicated himself wholeheartedly to the rewriting of the history of art, who has devoted his amazing analytical, creative, social, and poetic energies to this challenge, and who has been tremendously successful in this endeavor. I would like to thank you, Jonathan, for your willingness to come to the Institute of Art and Visual History and to engage with our students and with us in conversations which have been eye-opening for many. I think that the audience tonight, which includes artists, critics, historians, writers, publishers, educators, curators, and activists, many of whom wear more than one of these hats, attests to the fact that your work relates deeply to our current artistic, social, and political challenges. Thank you so much, and we look forward to your lecture.
Thank you so much, Eva. I will try to live up to that introduction, and I don't think I can. Okay. This is what disease looks like at the moment immediately before it becomes an epidemic, when it's but a set of disconnected symptoms. As it transforms into an epidemic, or worse, a plague, this cluster of symptoms ceases to be individuated, for it acquires a new social dimension, and the once lonely sufferer now becomes a carrier, their body under a threat they can no longer call their own, for now it menaces another body, that collective abstraction we call the social. The minute the social body is threatened, the martial metaphor's routine in the fight against disease assume an altogether different, darker, even sinister cast. For they are now aimed not at the illness, but against its sufferers. Recast not as sick people, but as vectors of contagion. Soon the die is cast, and one is either a friend or an enemy, us or the other. Thus, epidemics efficiently turn disease into social pathology and remap the etiology of infection along ruthlessly segregated battle lines. What I'm showing you here is literally the first AIDS painting, or at least the first that I've been able to find in 10 years of research. Painted by the Israeli artist Izar Patkin immediately after a routine visit to his dermatologist's office, it abstractly depicts the blue-black lesions known as Kaposi sarcoma, breaking through a skin of yellow latex at a human scale of exactly 6 feet high. Kaposi's would soon become a familiar sign of AIDS, and I distinctly remember that about half the men in my gym, a gay gym in San Francisco, would soon become spotted. But this painting was done, Patkin affirms, in 1981, 1 year before AIDS, even GRID, its previous utterly symptomatic handle abbreviating gay-related immune deficiency, was coined. Patkin reports that at the dermatologist's office, he sat in a waiting room, bracketed by 3 or 4 men, all covered by these strange, unfamiliar lesions. As a gay man, he had also heard rumors of this new gay cancer that was attacking the community, so he went home, he tells me, and painted this work. It's remarkably prescient, moreover, because he named it Unveiling of a Modern Chastity. It was a very early recognition of how this new affliction would change gay men's social and erotic lives, which we then understood as, if not identical, certainly closely adjoining. While Patkin's title hints at a social dimension to the painting, the image itself is resolutely embodied, phenomenological, for AIDS, not yet a plague, was at this early phase an affliction borne by its sufferers alone. But as David Wojnarowicz once said, quote, "I didn't realize when I contracted a disease, I contracted a diseased society as well," end quote. He recognized that epidemics surface inequalities. There's nothing like sickness and death to unequivocally materialize one's standing in the social hierarchy, because the more sickness and death you witness, the lower the social rung you occupy. Epidemics, whether AIDS or COVID, do not equalize everyone as potentially vulnerable, but conversely, they work very hard to solidly and materially differentiate one from the other. Epidemics are therefore among the most formative, albeit uncredited, social forces in human history, and they have sadly always worked in only one direction. They, of course, consistently reify extant social hierarchies. They do this through one of the most potent forms of ideological sleight of hand, through naturalizing repressive social distinctions, offering a kind of biomedical rationale for existing social prejudices, then proclaiming this division of the haves from the have-nots as, of course, but a necessary health precaution. Whether we're talking about AIDS or COVID, ideological containment and social segregation are as much symptoms of any epidemic as is the disease itself. I often hear that we have AIDS to thank for the resurgent attention to and victories in the queer rights struggle today. AIDS, the thinking goes, moved queerness into general discourse and thus enforced renewed political attention to our causes, a harbinger of our more recent victories such as marriage equality. But in fact, nothing could be further from the truth. For AIDS actually set back the queer rights movement by decades, and it did so first by reifying a divide, at least in discursive terms, of the at-risk from the not at risk, shoring up the cleaving of one America from the other at precisely the moment when this weakened opposition was finally beginning to break. In the late 1970s, pleasure palaces like Studio 54 soared precisely because they mingled celebrities and bold-faced names with very hot gay men rutting in public. When a famous old gay bathhouse, New York's Continental Baths, where a very young Bette Midler once entertained, became Plato's Retreat, a straight sex club, and the Village People became a huge crossover hit, it was clear that the pre-AIDS buffer between gay and straight culture was eroding. And even as a young gay man, I felt that. But soon AIDS would rebuild that boundary wall through instrumentalizing the notion of contagion and its unspoken obverse, of course, purity. In its wake, musty stereotypes associated with queerness, including the notion of an invisible taint that sickened the young, entailing a miserable life and an early, tragic death, came roaring back, now horrifically materialized because of AIDS. Through facilitating the creation of a false binary between the diseased and the healthy, AIDS allowed people to temporarily forget the legion of other threats to their well-being then happening in the 1980s, while rallying around a vision of a necessary social hygiene that has been responsible for most of the greatest of human cruelties. We can see this play out in real time. Watch what happens in 1981, the year that Patkin painted his unveiling of a modern chastity, but long before there was any general awareness of the new epidemic, AIDS. Bob Colacello would write in his book on Andy Warhol, quote, "At the end of summer, Andy and I were on the Eastern Shuttle on our way to Ronald Reagan's state dinner for Imelda and Ferdinand Marcos," end quote. The same year, Nancy Reagan graced the cover of Warhol's Interview magazine, giving readers the very first interview with the new First Lady since she moved into the White House, an interview also conducted by Colacello. This was a highly politicized placement, as numerous periodicals sought that first interview, but Warhol's magazine won it largely on the belief that its placement could recast boring old Republican conservatives as hip and cool and youth-oriented, even, dare we say it, gay-adjacent, as she was literally in the pages of the magazine, where her interview shared copy space with the work of a then brand-new emerging photographer by the name of Robert Mapplethorpe, along with homoerotic imagery by the great historical queer photographers George Platt Lynes and Herbert List. Clearly, absent plague, the now familiar battle lines simply did not yet exist. But a year later, by 1982, with the first emergence, first of GRID, then of AIDS, everything had changed. And of course, by the end of that decade, it was a completely different world in the United States, with the Christian right in rapid ascendance, AIDS mowing down huge swaths of my age group, and the queer community maligned as having brought about, happily for far too many, its own destruction. So when on June 12, 1989, Christina Orr-Cahal, the director of the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., canceled the Mapplethorpe retrospective called The Perfect Moment a few weeks before its opening and a few months after Mapplethorpe himself had died from HIV. She was, in her own words, protecting the institution she directed from a censorious Congress, apparently doing so by censoring the exhibition herself. Undeterred by her performative self-censorship, however, Senator Jesse Helms of North Carolina nonetheless took to the Senate floor and said, and I quote, "It's an issue of soaking the taxpayer to fund the homosexual pornography of Robert Mapplethorpe, who died of AIDS while spending the last years of his life promoting homosexuality," end quote. Now you're looking at the cover of Art4 magazine, chronicling our protest against the Corcoran's cancellation by actually projecting images of the banned exhibition on the white marble walls of the museum at night. So after the cancellation was announced, we found a very powerful projector and ran this all night long. The question of federal support for any art that even tangentially acknowledged either queerness or AIDS had been so brilliantly and repeatedly manipulated into a wedge issue by the Christian right and the Republican-dominated Senate that no less an authority than Ronald Reagan's spokesperson, Gary Bauer, could remark on TV in 1987 that the reason the president hadn't so much as uttered the word AIDS until 1985, at least 3, if not 4 years into the epidemic, was due to the fact, quote, that it hadn't spread into the general population. That's why, in the first museum work about AIDS, Grand Fear's public-facing window, Let the Record Show, from 1987, Reagan is featured alongside other AIDS criminals, as the window calls them, superimposed over a photograph of the Nuremberg trials that, of course, assessed Nazi guilt after World War II. But notice that the placard in front of him is empty, for he had literally nothing to say about the plague. Not so some of the other AIDS criminals, such as an anonymous surgeon who was quoted as saying, "We used to hate faggots on an emotional basis. Now we have a good reason." Or televangelist Jerry Falwell, "AIDS is God's judgment on a society that doesn't live by his rules," end quote. Bill Olander, a friend and the openly HIV-positive head curator of the new museum, when it really was the new museum and not yet sutured to the art market, told me that he commissioned this window installation because at that point, 5 years into the epidemic, there had literally been no museum engagement with AIDS. It had never once been mentioned. Much more characteristic of the museum field were the remarks of the very celebrated director of the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., J. Carter Brown, who, when asked about the Mapplethorpe controversy as it was blooming, said, "Let's be clear, we have to keep the First Amendment rights apart from the controversy," end quote, as if the decision to cancel wasn't already a First Amendment issue. But it was U.S. Senator Jesse Helms who repeatedly and aggressively worked to twin queerness and AIDS into a single collective threat against America. From his call for the creation of federal quarantine camps for the HIV positive, in defense of which he said, and I quote, "We used to quarantine for typhoid and scarlet fever, and it didn't ruin anybody's civil rights to do that," to his infamous Helms Amendment to a huge AIDS research and education bill that, quote, "would prohibit the use of any funds provided under this act to the Center of Disease Control from being used to provide either AIDS education, information, or prevention materials or activities that promote, encourage, or condone homosexual activities or the intravenous use of illegal drugs." Helms managed to turn a funding bill for AIDS not only into a frontal attack on its two most at-risk populations, queers and IV drug users, but then rob them of the information necessary to save their lives. In a truly chilling barometer of the national mood, Helms's flagrantly discriminatory bill passed the Senate by a vote of 94-2. This was, in essence, a national law against art about AIDS, and its effects were immediate and profound, effectively making the representation of either queerness or AIDS a violation of federal law. But Helms wasn't done. On June 23, 1989, he gave a speech on the Senate floor arguing that, quote, "Instead of denouncing the homosexual lifestyle, countless politicians, some in this chamber, fall in line with the repugnant, organized political movement attempting to persuade the American people that this is a desirable way to conduct their lives, as thousands more in this country will continue to die from AIDS while the homosexuals continue to proclaim the virtue of their perverse practices," end quote. No wonder David Wojnarowicz produced One Day This Kid a few months later, reading in part, "One day politicians will enact legislation against this kid, or one day this kid will talk. When he begins to talk, men who develop a fear of this kid will attempt to silence him with strangling, fists, prison, suffocation, rape, intimidation, drugging, ropes, guns, laws, menace, roving gangs, bottles, knives, religion, decapitation, and immolation by fire. Doctors will pronounce this kid curable as if his brain were a virus. This kid will lose his constitutional rights against the government's invasion of his privacy. All this will begin to happen in 1 or 2 years when he discovers he desires to place his naked body on the naked body of another boy," end quote. 4 years later, A.A. Bronson, formerly one of the 3 men who made up the Canadian group General Idea, took this photograph immediately after his partner, Felix Parts, had died of HIV infection. He then elected to blow it up to billboard size, so people couldn't turn away, couldn't avert their eyes, perfectly capturing the horror of the plague. It's the first image I can remember that transposed the gut-wrenching graphic horror of watching my friends die, so familiar from my daily life in my 20s and 30s, into art world terms, into representation. And what a representation. The lively clashing colors and patterns of cloth, enlivening everything in the picture, save that sunken face of the corpse frozen in the unavoidable materiality of death. Yet for all its power and political force, Felix, June 5th, 1994, is exactly the opposite of the kind of art I'm going to be addressing in the rest of this talk. That is to say, I won't be addressing the AIDS activist art we usually see, whether ACT UP's brilliant Grand Fury graphics or David Wojnarowicz's poignant works, or the work of furious mourning, as you see here. Instead, I want to address the many works of art about AIDS that don't look like art about AIDS, such as this one, Scott Burton's two-part chair from 1986. Seen from the front, it looks like a sturdy piece of modernist office furniture, and that's exactly what it was, available to decorate corporate skyscraper lobbies in Manhattan. But look at it as here from the side, and it tells, doesn't it, a different story. Burton's chair insinuates gay sex so obliquely that it deliberately reads as furniture, not as politics. A winkingly subversive take engineered to smoothly find its place in the lair of the enemy, such that a businessman could and did sit comfortably on it, unaware of all its other implications. And quite movingly, should either half of this chair become separated from its other half, it will cease to function and lose its identity as a chair. Two quotes from two of the leading AIDS-informed artists of the day, Jenny Holzer and Felix Gonzalez Torres, can help us understand what's going on. Holzer said in her 1983 to 1985 survival series, among the very earliest works of art about AIDS, and I quote her, "Use what is dominant in culture to change it quickly," end quote. Here you can see in her statements printed on condom wrappers evidence that she practiced what she preached. And if you can't make it out, it says, "In a dream you saw a way to survive, and you were full of joy." And the other one says, "Expiring for love is beautiful, but stupid." Her idea was to use what was dominant to change culture. Her idea to use what was dominant to change culture quickly manifests faith in the power of appropriation to infiltrate dominant culture, a primer on how to breach the wall that Helms so viciously was working to construct between two Americas. Tellingly, she here works to avoid reifying any kind of difference, preferring instead to operate within and as a member of dominant culture. So she's not speaking to one community or another, she's speaking to everyone. The other quote from Felix Gonzalez Torres underscores that artists at this time were faced with a stark choice under the Helms Amendment. Consider, for example, his Perfect Lovers from 1991. It's, of course, two identical clocks that gradually fall out of sync with one another, made in full consciousness of the artist's loss of his partner, Ross Laycock, that year. Quietly elegiac, but looking like a standard museum clock, so much so that many visitors didn't even register it as a work of art, the deftness of its political address was nothing if not intentional. As Gonzalez Torres noted in an interview, and I quote him, "You realize quickly that the most effective ideological constructions are the ones that don't look like it. If you say, I'm political, I'm ideological, that's not going to work because people know where you're coming from. But if you say, hi, my name is Bob, and this is it, then they say, well, that's not political. It's invisible, and it really works, end quote. And he continued, the right is very smart. And that is one thing that bugs me about artists who are doing so-called gay art and their limitation of what they consider as an object of desire for gay men. When I had a show at the Hirshhorn, Senator Stevens, who's one of the most homophobic anti-art senators, said he was going to come to my opening, and I thought he's going to have a really hard time explaining to his constituency how pornographic and how homoerotic two clocks side by side really are. He came there looking for dicks and asses, but there was nothing like that. Now, you try to see homoeroticism in my piece, end quote. As González-Torres' statement underscores, artists at this time were faced with a stark choice. Under the Helms Amendment, they could make a straightforwardly engaged and political art, but the price they paid was exclusion from the mainstream art world and join from participation in that network of museums and galleries and collectors that is the ladder to success in today's art world. Worse still, overtly dissident work could certainly feed the repressive machinery of the far right, as González-Torres underscored in his comment about Senator Stevens wanting to politicize his work. The alternative approach entailed camouflaging political intentions, thus circulating within the mainstream art world and reaching a vastly greater audience than the more overtly political artists ever could, while at the same time removing the targets they had on their backs as queer artists. In this 1992 work called Untitled Blood, González-Torres has the viewer walk through a curtain of blood-red beads at exactly the moment of national hysteria about blood-borne HIV transmission. But note there's no direct reference to AIDS to be found either in its title or its images. Like all of his work, its official title is merely untitled, but there is a parenthetical following the untitled, here saying the word blood, which helps direct signification with the lightest of touches. No wonder so much AIDS art doesn't look like AIDS art. For ever more draconian laws and ever more subtle art world norms work to outlaw any art that addressed either queerness or AIDS directly. As a result, an entire generation of artists began to think about their representational practices first and foremost strategically, evaluating the forces marshaled against them while seeking to circumvent, confront, or flout the now codified prohibitions against the representation of AIDS and homosexuality. These artists were thus forced to engage in a complicated calculus, whereby any work of art was tested against a reading of extant social networks and discursive conditions, of prejudices and stereotypes, of laws and customs and institutional parameters, to yield a work precisely calibrated to function in the space between possibility and foreclosure, between influence and censorship. Supremely alive to the discursive affect of their work, this age generation learned expertly how to read the weather, frequently tacking or even dissimulating if that was required. Shortly before his death in 1996, González-Torres articulated his credo as an artist and as an activist, and I quote him, "At this point, I don't want to be outside the structure of power. I don't want to be the opposition, the alternative. Alternative to what? To power? No, I want to have power. It's effective in terms of change. I want to be like a virus that belongs to the institution. All the ideological apparatuses are, in other words, replicating themselves, because that's the way culture works. So if I function as a virus, as an imposter, as an infiltrator, I will always replicate myself together with those institutions," end quote. Now, when an HIV-positive artist not only allies himself with the virus, that was killing him, but sought to personify it, something important is happening. When HIV infects a body, its evolutionary stroke of genius is to turn the immune system's own defenses against the host. The AIDS virus attaches onto the CD4 white blood cells responsible for fighting infections and then inserts its own RNA into those cells. Thus infected, the white blood cell, rather than fighting AIDS, now produces and releases millions of AIDS viruses into the body, viruses that repeat the process with other cells. And because the infection is housed within the host's own white blood cells, the body's remaining healthy disease-fighting white blood cells don't recognize it and thus cannot attack it. As the immune system is eventually overcome, the host dies from one or another opportunistic infection. In the context of an art world immune system that, under pressure of the Helms Amendment, framed both homosexuality and AIDS as dangerous invaders to be eliminated, numerous artists, beginning with the first stirrings of what would become a full-scale culture war, pioneered a new viral approach to confront the exclusionary infection-fighting mechanisms aimed against them. In one of the great historical ironies of the era, these artists took HIV, the very virus that was killing them, as the blueprint and the battle plan for a similarly clandestine and camouflaged attack. In their hands, the very glossary of AIDS, viral, clandestine, camouflage, infection, became the lexicon of an art world revolution that knew, like HIV itself, that the immune system was the best vector of any attack, precisely because once the immune system is infected, it cannot attack itself. Formally and theoretically sophisticated, spare, and elegant, artists as different as González Torres and General Idea evaded the art world's immune system precisely to the degree that their work was the material obverse of a recognizable image of either queerness or AIDS. Here is General Idea's A Year and a Day of AZT, that first HIV drug. Conjoining the annual and daily doses of what was then the only approved medication. In place of hot politics and messy embodiment, of figuration redolent of sex and leaking potentially infected bodily fluids, General Idea chose a cool, post-minimal abstraction that, save for the title, seems to bear no relationship to AIDS. 2 years later, General Idea's White AIDS is even more, well, viral. The word AIDS, now typographically identical to the word love in Robert Indiana's famous sculpture, and it's printed on each of these canvases in serried rows, but always in white on white. The canvases themselves are then hung on white wallpaper, itself repeatedly printed with the word AIDS in white on white. In its overarching clinical whiteness, AIDS is everywhere in this installation, and yet utterly invisible. A telling art world materialization of a larger social dynamic. Glenn Ligon's magisterial, untitled, I'm turning into a specter before your very eyes, and I'm going to haunt you, is a black requiem that, anticipating white AIDS, grows increasingly illegible as the eye moves down the canvas. Like the word you in its title, it's a shifter, its meaning the result of an interaction between viewer and artist. That illegibility also animates Anne Meredith's 1987 photographic series of largely black women with AIDS, the first such documentation of women with AIDS in the United States. But when she went back to show her subject this picture, the subject had a change of heart and asked her not to show it, worried that she had enough challenges in her life without becoming the public face of AIDS as well. So they compromised on this work, in which the subject meticulously scratched out her own face. The pretense that any given work of art was not about AIDS could be paper thin, or even, in the case of the artist Rudy Lemke, manifestly intended to be found out. In his exquisite artist book, Finnegan's Wake, its title, of course, punning on James Joyce's great experimental novel, Finnegan's Wake, Lemke poignantly multiplies terms associated with death. Of course, fin and, again, wake as in the idea of holding a wake for burial. Borrowing a strategy from the queer composer John Cage, who himself deployed Finnegan's Wake for a series of mesodics, a poetic format in which a term is spelled down vertically in the middle of the poem, Lemke has upended Cage's chance operations in favor of actually deliberately searching Joyce's novel for terms resonant of HIV infection. Look carefully at these drawings from the series. Do you see how he spells out the names of AIDS drugs down the middle? AZT, right, in the first instance, and foscarnet, a drug used to treat AIDS-related blindness, in the second. Selecting words resonant of greed in the first instance, pawnbrokers monopolized desperation, and referencing blindness in the second, fugus suddenly lost chance, facts resembling certainly imperfect sight. Or here, how the artist Jack Pearson takes found letters from trade signs and reassembles them into a cross reading desire, despair, twinned emotions for gay men like Pearson in 1996, a year before the first effective AIDS drug regimen appeared, even as he challenged then prevalent ideas that AIDS was confined to only certain populations, anyone. Coterminous with the advent of this AIDS viral art, a new kind of art criticism was coming to the fore, one we can generalize as postmodernism. A central tenet of this new critical tendency was to view the idea of authorship with suspicion, and one short text, above all, came to assume a position of prominence, Roland Barthes' The Death of the Author. Although initially published in the legendary American avant-garde journal Aspen in 1967, it would achieve new currency and a permanent spot on U.S. college syllabi only after it was anthologized in English in Barthes' text, Image, Music, Text of 1977, the same year as Douglas Crimp's famous pictures exhibition at Artist Space in New York. The group of artists featured in this exhibition, named by Crimp as the Pictures Generation, emblematized this new turn towards an anti-authoriality through images that appropriated the work of other photographers. Countering the common notion that it is the author who determines the meaning of a text, Barthes argued that it is instead always us, the readers, who make up any text's meaning in the act of reading it. In The Death of the Author, Barthes elevated what he termed readerly activity, the interpretive act of reading, even going so far as to claim, as the titles of the essay underscores, that we actually have no real need of authors, since all meaning is inherently readerly. Despite the fact that Michel Foucault effectively gutted many of Barthes' claims in his much more socially, historically grounded text, What is an Author, from 1969, tellingly, Barthes' arguments proved defining in the development of American art criticism in the 1980s. So when Sherry Levine rephotographed Walker Evans's famous 1930s Dust Bowl images, first published in Evans and James Agee's celebrated Depression-era book, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, and showed them without commentary as her own work in a 1980 exhibition at Metro Pictures, simply called After Walker Evans, she was seen as literalizing and materializing Barthes' influential ideas about the death of the author. Although these photographs were originally intended as a form of progressive, politically engaged reportage, albeit in a particularly refined form, And Evans's partner, A.G., underscored their activist intent when he wrote in the book that published them, above all else, in God's name, don't think of this as art, end quote. No critic at the time noted the peculiar irony of restaging Evans's fervent call for economic and social justice in the white-walled confines of a commercial art gallery. But then again, since meaning was now declared to be entirely readerly, what Evans and Agee intended was of little consequence. And Levine, in a double irony, even quoted parts of Barth's Death of the Author essay as her own artist statement. As the pictures generation's chief critical move, appropriation, quickly became a hallmark of postmodern art in the early 1980s, it spurred a revolution that derided modernism's ostensible elevation of originality in favor of the appropriated, the contingent, and the manifestly ironic or disingenuous. Already at this relatively early stage, we can glimpse some of the lineaments of what would shortly become postmodernism's peculiar relation to the social world it claimed to demystify. Ironically, for a critical method rooted in exposing hidden ideological values, apparently postmodernist criticism did not see or did not care that these were once intended as activist images. And more to the point, and this is central, that they were activist images would have been viewed as a critical weakness for activism, with its heavy overlay of authorial intention and its assumption of an inherent linkage between art and social effect was seen as dangerously naive. A self-consciously activist art reproduced a simplistic account of expressive intention that ignored the many ways any statement was always already bound up in a complex web of social meanings that tended to contain, if not vitiate, the prospect of producing real social change. Indeed, activist art was often seen as a kind of false consciousness for its implicit claim to a direct, which is to say, privileged or unmediated relationship between authorial intent and the social. But I ask you, what happens to the death of the author when authors actually begin to die in droves, when it ceases to be merely a metaphor? It was, after all, exactly this circumstance that caused Douglas Crimp to quit October magazine's editorial board after 13 years in 1987, publishing a book that aggressively linked his criticism with activism, even in its title, AIDS Cultural Analysis, Cultural Activism, while illustrating that famous Grand Fury window on its cover. My point is that AIDS artists, counting on an orthodox postmodernist anti-authoriality and a refusal to credit their intentions, were thus able to seed their work with a range of personal and expressive meanings that they knew a theoretically sophisticated art world trained in the death of the author would not see, or if they saw them, feel compelled to articulate. At the same time, they also knew that a broad general public would find these other, more authorial and political meanings compelling, not least for their connection to traditional artistic values like narration and expression, then in preciously short supply within the postmodern art world. Remarkably, this attitude allowed artists to address AIDS, if done with the right touch, directly under the noses of both Philistines like Jesse Helms, the senator, and art world sophisticates like Rosalind Krauss, confident that the viral meanings of such art would always operate either above or below their frequencies, as either too high or too low to be detected. And even more, the art world could point to postmodernist theories' denigration of authoriality to rationalize its own refusal to articulate the now dangerous identity politics that Helms and company sought to police. In the context of postmodernism, that same artwork could then frame its silence not as cowardice, but is in fact the more progressive political position. And here's the cherry on the top. In the face of the presumption that art about AIDS held fast to a woefully under-theorized belief in expression, an art that refused to articulate a politics about AIDS was actually the more engaged, the more of its moment, and finally, the more resistant or dissident. It should now be clear that there were two powerful streams converging on AIDS art in the first decade and a half of this epidemic. The aggressively homophobic discourse of the resurgent religious right, enabled by Reagan and Bush, and a much less vituperative but equally chilling theoretical discourse that worked hard to place expressive intent out of bounds, and with it, any account of authorial context, biography, or politics. Together, these two vastly different social forces policed the representation of AIDS, one brutally, the other with kid gloves. But the net effect was that Jesse Helms and Rosalind Krauss, from their opposite perches and with very different agendas, nonetheless produced a virtual art world silence in the face of the most vicious attacks on Americans' cherished ideal of freedom of expression since McCarthyism. And once so many authors had died their double deaths, figurative and literal, few remained to puncture this expedient silence. Indeed, a strategic, fully self-conscious authorial camouflage constitutes one of the enduring legacies of this AIDS era of art. An AIDS generation taught contemporary artists that making a statement did not necessarily entail forthright admission, and that clues, hints, silences, and elisions could possess, in the right context, an unusually expressive eloquence. Here I'm showing you Andres Serrano's Milk Blood, looking like nothing so much as hard-edged abstraction after the model of someone like Ellsworth Kelly. This photograph has nothing about AIDS about it, but with that title, we begin to revise our understanding of its formal terms and see that it deals with the two dominant vectors of HIV infection, milk and blood, just like semen and blood does, albeit in this instance looking more like a gestural painting. AIDS, in short, brought about a new kind of art, pregnant with associative content, but not declarative, an art that bit its own tongue. Let me illustrate this point. In Untitled Buffalo, even the activist artist David Wojnarowicz makes what I would call a viral artwork, here photographing a diorama in New York City's Natural History Museum concerning indigenous hunting strategies to suggest an equivalency between queers and the buffalo in the early days of westward expansion, when whites thoughtlessly slaughtered buffalo by the millions and pushed the breed to the point of extinction. And here is Facing Extinction, a work by Ronald Lockett, a young, prodigiously talented African-American artist in Bessemer, Alabama, a town named for the Bessemer steel furnace used in its production. As a physically slight, artistically inclined man from a blue-collar, Rust Belt community, Lockett kept his illness entirely to himself and only said he had the flu or a cold until his first and, sadly, fatal bout with pneumonia in 1998. Poor, not formally educated as an artist, albeit utterly convinced of his gifts, Lockett's work is now only finally emerging in the public eye decades after his death. An image of a lone buffalo in striated sheet metal struggling to emerge out of the rust-red surface of the work, Facing Extinction, poignantly echoes the Wojnarowicz. Yet it's highly unlikely that in 1994 he would have known it. Today, we firmly understand AIDS as a highly politicized disease whose etiology is inseparable from discrimination. In fact, it has become the textbook case of the intersection of pathology and social prejudice. But before this moment, before AIDS was marked as communal, it was not only solitary, but painfully isolating and debilitatingly secretive. So virulent was the social and political hostility that many people with AIDS, such as Lockett, never once disclosed their serostatus. And U.S. newspapers were filled with euphemisms about unmarried young men who died after a short respiratory illness. Dying of AIDS wasn't something to mourn, it was something to hide. Before an activist community aggressively fought back against this refusal to name and specify AIDS, in the process forging a wildly successive collective politics around the disease, AIDS was in the closet as surely as homosexuality had been several generations before. Yet the same imagery manages to bridge the enormous gulf between an urban, professional, largely middle-class, majority white AIDS activist culture and the very different trials of a black man living with AIDS in the rural South. It can do so precisely because there is a shared collective recognition around the idea of the American buffalo and its history of wholesale slaughter. Frank Moore's masterful lullaby then appropriates the self-same appropriated buffalo and places it in the scene of yet another appropriation, this time of arguably the most emblematic work of AIDS art ever made, González Torres's untitled Bed, one of a number of billboards that sprouted in New York without any initial commentary, looking more like a sophisticated ad campaign for a betting company than any work of art. Only gradually did the work's significance dawn, and this bed, with its empty impression of two bodies, accrue power as a sign of all we had lost. Then Joy Episalo's pillow, number 5, pushes off González Torres's elevated, pristine white bed to land it on the floor and makes the top pillow dirty, infectious, in recognition of the actual conditions of AIDS in America, which were not pristine. Then Ronnie Horn's Gold Mats Paired for Ross and Felix exploits the same idea of a pairing and sheets in tribute to Felix, who had himself succumbed to AIDS the year after this work was completed, taking advantage of the mechanical properties of thinly beaten gold leaf with its attraction and repulsion and its susceptibility to movements in the currents of air. This work is as sensitive to the viewer's presence as González Torres's work, albeit in a different key. And then Dean Samashima, born a generation younger, who grew up and came out in the midst of AIDS. And so he takes that very same image vocabulary and turns its resonance from loss and death to life and pleasure, here photographing the beds in bathhouses where he has had sex with random strangers, reclaiming the pleasures of his gay life, even in the face of the plague. My point is that there is a dialogue going on here, sotto voce, but if you concentrate, you can hear it, and it speaks of collectivity and community. Let's take as an example González Torres's largest candy spill, Untitled Placebo, 1991, a work that, like the other candy spills, invites the audience to take and eat a piece of candy, thereby inaugurating an act with threefold significance. As a resistance to the highly politicized othering of people with AIDS, as an echo of Catholic ideas of communion, and as literal contact with the infected at a time when AIDS protocols still work to powerfully isolate people with AIDS. At 1,200 pounds of candy, it is by far the largest of these types of work. And in its massive silvery elegance, I think it's one of the most beautiful. But here, the parenthetical title, placebo, also initiates a problem. Why use a term that in pharmacological studies refers to the ineffective substitute of a drug that is supposed to have an effect? Why is placebo at a scale that dwarfs all the other candy spills? To hear the González-Torres Foundation tell it, this is mere happenstance with no political intent. A reading now echoed across the art world. And they told me, and I quote, there is no more politics about AIDS in this work than there is politics about the troubles in Northern Ireland, end quote. But according to the CDC itself, the Center for Disease Control in the United States, the upper limit of CD4 T helper cells that are the target of the HIV virus is, you guessed it, 1,200, exactly the same weight in pounds as placebo. As we are invited to take and consume the candy, that number, of course, diminishes, just as the body's CD4 cells themselves diminish following HIV infection. And as we eat the candy, we are the ones responsible for the destruction of this immune system, a political charge leveled at us with the gentlest of touches. But if the scale of the work is related to an optimal healthy CD4 count, why then does he call it placebo? In this context, the artist himself was eloquent, noting in an interview in 1993 with reference to his deceased partner, Ross Laycock, and I quote, Freud said that we rehearse our fears in order to lessen them. In this way, letting go of the work, this refusal to make a static form, a monolithic sculpture, in favor of a disappearing, changing, unstable, and fragile form, was an attempt on my part to rehearse my fears of having Ross disappear day by day right in front of my very eyes, end quote. So according to this frame of reference, placebo is a placebo for the artist's loss, a means of rehearsing grief, or rather its performed equivalent, before the real horror of loss took hold. As González-Torres probably intended, Untitled Placebo has become at once an irritant and a joy, a riddle to be solved and something to be valued in purely aesthetic terms. All versions of this work, my meanings and the Felix González-Torres Foundation's, must ultimately bow before the social situation the work engenders. That social experience, that act of encounter, at once collective and individual, calls upon some of us so inclined to plumb its possible depths, while at the same time let others enjoy it as generous and even a democratic celebration of an art that invites rather than excludes. On this latter form of meaning, too, the artist is eloquent, and it is worth quoting him at length to convey something of his emotional tenor. When I saw the show at the Hirshhorn Museum in Washington, there was one particular guard who was standing with a big candy floor piece untitled Placebo, and she was amazing. There was this suburban white middle-class mother with two young sons who came into the room, and in 30 seconds, this woman who was black, maybe church-going, a civil servant in Washington, in the midst of all this reactionary pressure about the arts, there she was, explaining to this mother and kids about AIDS and what this piece represented, what a placebo is, how there was no cure, and so on. Then the boys started to fill their pockets with candies. And she sort of looked at them like a schoolmistress and said, "You're only supposed to take one." Just as their faces fell, they tossed back all but a few. She suddenly smiled again and said, "Okay, well, maybe two." And she won them over completely. The whole thing worked because then they got the piece, they got the interaction, they got the generosity, and they got her. It was so great, end quote. In this account, AIDS, social interaction, generosity, forms of class and race inversion, and the sheer force of a guard's personality all conspire to animate a work of art for children. In the context of AIDS plague and the enforced othering that our enemies sought to engender, here is an art that reaches across the divide and touches, or better, invites our touch. It does not seek to segregate some experiences and some meanings from others, for experience itself is an undifferentiated state, only hierarchized upon reflection. Children, above all, know this, and so they were always the artist's model in talking about his work. My point is that these works of art address us hopefully seeking relationships, and not just a relationship, but a form of contact, visceral and embodied. Relational aesthetics doesn't know where it began, but it began here, in a socio-political context in which the mere act of touching was so fraught, so loaded with terrors of contamination and infection, that it became inherently political. While most AIDS art tended towards the confrontational, unintentionally reifying the divide between us and them, here and there, that very divide that Helms and company were so busy stoking, a viral art held fast to faith in the idea of collectivity and community, so that even a work about AIDS spoke to children in a language they could understand. Under plague conditions, a viral art not only brought us together, but it made that fraught contact over into a form of politics that didn't divide, but unify. My point is that strategically speaking, we are all children of AIDS, even those of us who disown any knowledge of it. That I can still speak of a collective, a we, after the experience of AIDS is evidence of its discursive success. And if you look carefully, you can perhaps read the words behind Jimmy DeSano's extraordinary photograph, Gooseberries, with its glowing lanterns in the dark. Jimmy died of the plague shortly after making this work. But the work, both the actual physical photograph and the potent array of meanings we make of it, live on. Out of death, you will note it says deathlessness. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for this lecture and for this argument that you're making, this strong argument about the ethical necessity to look again, but also about the communal joy to look again. And for kind of denying us, the communal we, to ignore any longer maybe the strategic representations, expressions of marginalized artists. So thank you for that. I'm sure that there are a lot of questions and comments by the audience. I will let you gather your thoughts for a few minutes and maybe start with one question or comment that came to my mind when I also looked at this array of artworks that you showed us, that I'm sure a lot of them were familiar, a lot of them weren't, but I'm sure a lot of us looked differently at them in this context. So it was interesting to me, this importance of titles, subtle but very pointed also. And I was wondering, because I felt that oftentimes the materials were so important as well, in a different but also quite subtle and pointed way to show this expressive intent that you were talking about. So the blood red plastic beads, or this I wrote down in the first work you showed, the latex theatrical wounds. So like the material, just the physicality of the stuff that went into these works, the marble hardness of the lobby chairs, and so I was wondering how does that play into your argument?
Great question. I believe that one of the things that AIDS art sought to do was to address the phenomenological, to address the embodied, precisely because exactly through that mechanism, it was able to do an end run around so much of the uncomfortable politics of the era and appeal to people directly and in a way that felt very real and very honest. One of the things that is striking about so much of AIDS art is its increasing emphasis on embodiment, on blood, on milk, on death, on things that we can relate to, that we can share. But at the same time, and this is what I think makes it so powerful, it refused to allow that embodiment to be the end in itself. It sought instead to make that a kind of prod to get the viewer to start thinking about deeper meanings.
Yes, thank you. Yes,
Thank you very much. It was a pure pleasure to listen to your lecture and also get this wonderful array of works. I have two questions, in fact. So you showed both sort of the twofold nature of the art world as very activist and the outrage that Reagan hasn't even mentioned the name of the disease for years. And you mentioned the exhibition at the New Museum in the window front, and I'm also thinking about the exhibition curated by Nan Goldin early on. And I am wondering whether you can say a little bit more about the sort of interdependence, because you focused on the more subversive works where it's not as the activism aspect is not as clearly visible. And I'm wondering whether you can say a little bit more about the sort of the interdependence between these two worlds within the art world, especially because people like David von Jerovic have sort of participated on both fronts. And then the second question, if I just add it, I haven't understood, I think it was too quickly for me. You mentioned that Rosalind Krauss participated in a silence, if I understood that correctly, but at the same time that confused me because the Douglas Crimp issue on AIDS and the disease was hosted by October, a magazine that Krauss and Annette Mickelson founded. So I think it was just too quick for me to understand. Maybe you can just expand a little bit on that.
I wasn't clear, so I'm grateful for the opportunity. So Douglas edited an issue on AIDS, and Rosalind Krauss killed it, refused to publish it in the magazine. And so Douglas went ahead and produced the book as his letter of resignation, essentially, from the board.
But wasn't it published, like you can download it these days on JSTOR as an October issue? Was it published retrospectively?
Exactly. Oh. Because it gave them a very black eye. Okay. Yeah. In terms of your second question, help me again, remind me about what the
twofoldness of the art world
yes.
and the interconnectedness.
So, in many respects, I think that much of the art that we looked at tonight would not have had the power it had not a number of activist artists done, a range of very angry works. If this had been the sole AIDS art, it would have passed under the radar. But because of the two in a kind of complicated conversation, we got to get that these artists were doing something subversive. And I think in many respects, what this shows us is that every activity is welcome.
Thank you so much for this incredible lecture. I wanted to ask a pretty art historical question. So what is the relationship with the artists that you showed? So Gonzalez Torres, of course, being a prominent example, to minimalist, the practice of minimalism, and then what followed, which was post-minimalism. So how does this relate first to minimalism and then post? Is it ironic? Is it parody? Is it just appropriation?
It's a great question. I mean, I think that what Felix is doing is, of course, appropriating and thus ironizing minimalism, taking minimalism to a place it never intended to go. And notably, most of the minimalist artists were sort of hyper-macho straight guys, right? And he's really skewering them. But what's, I think, compelling about that is that he's not the first, that post-minimalism, Robert Morse and company also did that, and interestingly enough, feminized a lot of the sort of hard edges of post-minimalist abstraction. So Robert Morse started using felt and let it drape in labial folds in front of the sort of minimalist iron boxes. So clearly, Felix is building on this, but I think that what neither of them were sort of interested in doing was commenting about the social political reality of the moment that it was happening, and that is what Felix, I think, is remarkable for engaging.
So I think we will allow another question from Charlotte Klonk. And
Jonathan, thank you very much for your talk. And just a very brief question, or request to tie in your answer that you gave to Eva concerning the phenomenological aspect of the work and its working, and it was obvious, but interestingly, you concentrated, and we are just looking at it now, that the subversive action actually happened in terms of language. So can you tie the two together? It seems to me the work starting with general ideas, AIDS, love, even with Felix González Torres and the titles, it always needs the language to do the slippage work. There's something about the phenomenological which can't quite do this.
Observation. And it's absolutely right. And I think that what art does is hit us emotionally. And that's actually, for me, always been the value of art, is that emotional attack. But then there's a level of processing that attack, coming to understand why we're feeling the way we're feeling about the work of art. And that's where the language comes in and helps to clarify and direct our cognition.
thank you so much. I think since we have the opportunity to engage in more conversation in just a few minutes, we will leave the questions here. Thank you again very, very much.